Let's begin with Chapter 1, Rules, Standards, and Laws. In this lesson, we will be discussing the objectives for situation awareness by identifying the difference between hazardous materials, WMD incidents, and other emergencies, identifying the location of both the emergency response plan and or the standard operating procedures, and defining the terms hazardous materials or dangerous goods in Canada, as well as weapons of mass destruction. We will also talk about the differences between standards and federal regulations that govern hazardous materials response activities, describe the different levels of hazardous materials training, awareness, operations, technician, specialist, and incident commander, explain the need for a planned response to a hazardous materials incident also. So who responds to hazardous materials WMD incidents? Firefighters, law enforcement personnel, and EMS personnel may be called upon to respond to these incidents. These can include structural fires, EMS calls, automobile accidents, confined space rescues, water rescues, and acts of terrorism. These and other situations may involve hazardous substances that threaten lives, property, and or the environment. The nature of the incident and the mentality of the responder changes when the responder suspects hazardous materials are present at the scene. Hazardous materials incidents are handled in a more deliberate fashion than structural firefighting because there could be unknown substances present. The setting may make it difficult to get a full picture of the incident, and then responders often take more time to get oriented to the problem and define a rational approach to solving the situation without being exposed to the released substance itself. Actions taken at hazardous materials incidents are largely dictated by the chemicals or the hazards that are involved, environmental influences, and the way that chemicals behave during the release. Personnel operating at a scene of a hazardous materials incident must be cautious of the potential or actual law enforcement aspect of the incident. Responders should be mindful of evidentiary issues associated with the incident, and also every responder must be cognizant of the impact his or her presence and actions will have for potential evidence gathering. When responding to hazardous materials incidents, make a conscious effort to change your perspective by slowing down, thinking about the problem and available resources, and take a well-considered actions to solve it. Initial and ongoing actions may be guided by your authority having jurisdiction and your local or organizational response plans or your SOPs. Every responder should have knowledge of and access to regular response plans and should have been trained on how to implement them. The authority having jurisdiction is the governing body that sets these operational policies and procedures for the jurisdiction which you operate in. So the goal of this text is to help you learn how to recognize the presence of hazardous materials in WMD incidents, take initial actions including establishing scene control zones, implementing your ICS, use basic reference sources, select proper PPE, implement product control measures when needed, and perform appropriate decontamination, and understand where you fit into the full-scale incident of a hazardous materials response. So what is a hazardous materials response anyway? A hazardous materials is any substance or material that is capable of posing an unreasonable risk to human health, safety, and the environment when transported in commerce, used incorrectly, or not properly stored or contained. This can include hazardous substances, wastes, marine pollutants, and elevated temperature materials, along with illicit laboratories, environmental crimes, and even industrial sabotage. In the United States model codes and regulations, hazardous materials are defined as dangerous goods. So let's talk about the definition of the United States Code for WMDs. A weapon of mass destruction is defined as any destructive device such as any explosive, incendiary, or poisonous gas, bomb, grenade, rocket having a propellant charge more than 4 ounces, a missile having an explosive or an incendiary charge of more than 0.25 ounces, a mine or similar device. It can be any weapon involving toxic or poisonous chemicals even, or any weapon involving a disease organism, any weapon designed to release radiation or radioactivity at a level dangerous to human life, and lastly, any destructive device dangerous to human life itself. So a WMD are known as many different abbreviations. The most common acronym is CBURN, which stands for Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, and Explosive. So from a responder's perspective, a hazardous material can be almost anything depending on the situation. Examples can include 5,000 gallons of milk leaking into a creek, a large chlorine gas release, any substance used as a terrorist weapon, and it would be unwise to believe that your jurisdiction is immune to deliberate criminal acts even. So with manufacturing processes, sometimes they generate hazardous wastes, and a hazardous waste is what remains after the process or manufacturing activity has used a substance and its material is no longer pure. This can be as dangerous as the pure chemical itself, and they can also compromise mixtures of several chemicals, which can make it difficult to determine how the substance will react when released or if it will encounter other chemicals even. So let's talk about the levels of training, regulations, and standards. Responders must recognize the regulatory drives that apply to hazardous materials response. Differences between regulations and standards. Regulations are issued and enforced by government bodies such as OSHA and the EPA, whereas standards are issued by non-governmental entities and are generally consensus-based. Standards can even be voluntary. Organizations such as the NFPA issue voluntary, consensus-based standards. The technical committee is responsible for periodically revising any NFPA standard and is required to meet regularly, revise and update possible change to a standard, review and act on any public comments during the revision process, and once the standard has been finalized, agencies may choose to adopt it. State-planned states and non-planned states. Each state has the right to adopt and/or supersede workplace health and safety regulations put forth by OSHA. States that adopt OSHA regulations are considered state-planned states. About half the states are state-planned states, and Indiana is an example of a state-planned state. States that have non-adopted OSHA regulations are non-planned states. These are EPA states because they follow Title CFR Code 40, Protections of the Environment, Part 311, Worker Protection. The CFR is a collection of permanent rules established by the federal government and includes 50 titles. NFPA standards and OSHA regulations. The Technical Committee of Hazardous Materials Response Personnel is responsible for NFPA standards governing hazardous materials and includes more than 30 members. The three published standards important to personnel who may be called upon to respond to hazardous materials incidents include NFPA 472, 1072, and 473. 472 outlines training competencies for all hazardous materials responders. 1072 identifies the minimum job requirements, or JPRs, and 473 spells out the competencies required for EMS personnel rendering care at hazardous materials incidents. With NFPA 1072, it applies to the following levels of responder: awareness, operations, mission-specific operations, hazardous materials technician, and incident commander. NFPA 473 also contains mission-specific competencies in a familiar manner to 472, and NFPA 1072, including advanced life support responders assigned to a hazmat team, ALS responders assigned to provide clinical interventions at hazardous materials incidents, and ALS responders assigned to treatment of smoke inhalation victims. Another NFPA standard recently developed and published is NFPA 475. The intent of this document is to establish common criteria for the organization, management, programmatic elements, deployment of personnel, and resources for those entities responsible for hazardous materials emergency preparedness functions. The OSHA document containing hazardous materials response competencies is commonly referred to as HAZWOPER, Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. The training levels found within HAZWOPER are awareness, operations, technician, specialist. Specialist is recognized only in OSHA HAZWOPER, and incident commander. NFPA 472 is updated every 5 years, much more frequently than OSHA HAZWOPER regulations. NFPA 472 and HAZWOPER are intended to provide guidance on competencies associated with the various training levels, but they are not how to respond documents. 1072 is intended to identify the JPRs that personnel should be able to perform and carry out their job duties. JPRs are to be accomplished in accordance with the requirements of the authority having jurisdiction. So let's talk about awareness level. NFPA 1072 section 4.1.1 awareness level personnel are those persons who, during the course of their normal duties, could encounter an emergency involving hazardous materials or weapons of mass destruction and who are expected to recognize the presence of hazardous materials, to protect themselves and call for trained personnel and secure the area. 472 states a person with awareness level training is not considered to be a responder. These individuals are now referred to as awareness level personnel. Persons receiving this level of training are not typically called to the scene to respond. Awareness level personnel functions are considered supporting roles. Some of the tasks for awareness level personnel may be expected to perform at a scene can include analyzing the incident to detect the presence of hazardous materials, identifying the name and United Nations or North American Hazardous Materials Code, identification number, type of placard, or other distinctive marking that applies to hazardous materials or WMDs, collecting information from the current edition of the EGR about the hazard, initiating and implementing protective actions consistent with the response plan, SOPs, and current edition of the EGR, initiating the notification process, and personnel must, at the awareness level, must meet the requirements defined as Chapter 4 of 1072. OSHA's HAZWOPER designates awareness level personnel as responders. It states first responders at the awareness level are individuals who are likely to witness or discover the hazardous substance release and who have been trained to initiate a response sequence by notifying the proper authorities of the release. They would take no further action beyond notifying the authorities of this release. First responders at the awareness level should have sufficient training and experience to demonstrate competency in the following areas: an understanding of what hazardous substances are and the risks associated with them, an understanding of the potential outcomes of an incident, the ability to recognize the presence of hazardous substances, and the ability to identify hazardous substances if possible. An understanding of the role of the first responder awareness individual in the response plan is the ability to determine the need for additional resources and to notify the communications center. With the operations level per NFPA 1072, operations level responders are those persons who are tasked to respond to hazardous materials for the purpose of taking action to protect nearby persons, environment, or property from the effects of any release. These persons may also have competencies specific to their response mission, expected tasks, and equipment as training as determined by the authority having jurisdiction. The core competencies are based on the vital tasks that operations personnel should perform on the scene of a hazardous materials incident. Examples can include analyzing the scene of a hazardous material WMD incident to determine the scope of the incident, surveying the scene to identify containers and materials involved, collect information from available resource references, and predict the likely behavior of the hazardous material. They can also estimate the potential harm the substances may cause, plan a response to the release including selection of the correct level of PPE, and perform decontamination procedures and preserve evidence, and lastly, evaluate the status and effectiveness of the response itself. So, core competency training is required for all operations level responders on the scene, no matter what their function is. One of the goals of the 472 standard is to better match the expected tasks that may be required of the responder with the training that the responder should receive. Responders who are expected to perform additional missions beyond the core competencies must be trained to carry out these mission-specific responsibilities. Operations level responders may end up performing a limited suite of technical level skills but do not have broader knowledge and abilities of a hazardous materials technician. 472 and 1072 provide a mechanism to ensure that operations level responders do never go beyond their level of training and equipment. This is done by using technical level personnel to provide direct guidance to the operations level responder operating at a hazardous materials incident. This guidance may be provided through direct visual observation or through assessments communicated from the operations level responders to a technician. Mission-specific competencies, as defined by NFPA 1072 Section 3.4.1, are as follows. The knowledge, skills, and judgment needed by operations level responders who have completed the operations level competencies and who are designated by the authority having jurisdiction to perform mission-specific tasks such as decontamination, victim hostage rescue, recovery, evidence preservation, and even sampling. The 11 mission-specific competencies can include personal protective equipment, mass decontamination, technical decontamination, evidence preservation and public safety sampling, product control, detection, monitoring, and sampling, and victim rescue and recovery. With illicit disembowelment and disruption of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, improvised WMD dispersal devices, and operations at improvised explosive laboratories, diving in contaminated water environments, and evidence collection. The OSHA Hazmat regulation mandates that the operations level responder must be trained to respond in a defensive fashion without trying to stop the release directly, while avoiding contact with the released substance itself. Their function is to contain the release from a safe distance and keep it from spreading and reduce the potential for human exposures. First responders at the operations level are expected to have received at least 8 hours of training or to have had sufficient experience to objectively demonstrate competencies as follows. Knowledge of the basic hazard and risk assessment techniques, knowledge of how to select and use proper PPE provided, an understanding of basic hazardous materials terms, knowledge of how to perform basic control, containment, or confinement operations within the capabilities of the resources and PPE available with the unit, knowledge of how to implement basic decontamination procedures, an understanding of relevant SOPs and termination procedures, and operations level JPRs are listed as requisite knowledge and requisite skills. The JPRs are found in Chapters 5 of NFPA 1072. And the JPRs for operations are much more action-oriented. With the technician level, NFPA 1072 Section 7.1.1 defines individuals at the technician level as those persons who respond to hazardous materials using a risk-based response process by which they analyze a problem involving hazardous materials, plan the response to the problem, implement a planned response, evaluate progress of the planned response, and assist in terminating the incident itself. The hazardous materials technician is a person who responds to hazardous materials incidents using a risk-based response process with the ability to analyze the problem involving hazardous materials, selecting appropriate decontamination procedures, control a release using specialized protective clothing and control equipment. The hazardous materials technician should have additional competencies that are specific to their response mission. Expected tasks and equipment and training are determined by the authority having jurisdiction as well. Technician level personnel are integral to NFPA 472 standard because they are in many cases intended to supervise the activities of on-scene personnel responders. The individuals at the technician level act for the purpose of stopping the release. A technician will likely assume a more proactive role than a first responder at the operations level would, and technicians typically function at a higher level in terms of their cognitive approach to the response. They will approach the point of release to plug, patch, or otherwise mitigate the problem itself. Per the OSHA Hazmat regulation, hazardous materials technicians should have at least 24 hours of training equal to the first responder operations level. Technicians should also have the competency, knowledge, and understanding necessary to fulfill the following duties. Implement the employer's emergency response plan. classify, identify, and verify known and unknown materials by using field survey instruments and equipment, function within an assigned role in the ICS, select and use proper specialized chemical PPE, understand hazard and risks assessment techniques. They also should perform advanced control, containment, and/or confinement operations within the capabilities of the resources and PPE available within their unit, understand and implement the decontamination procedures. They should also understand termination procedures and understand basic chemical and toxicological terminology and behavior. The specialist level is identified only in the OSHA Hazmat standard. This level of responder receives more specialized training than a hazardous materials technician would. With the incident commander per NFPA 1072, incident commanders is the person who is responsible for all incident activities, including the development of strategies and tactics and the ordering and release of resources. The IC must receive additional training necessary to meet applicable governmental occupational health and safety regulations and the specific needs of the jurisdiction itself. Individuals trained as ICs should have at least operations level training as well as additional training specific to the commanding a hazardous materials incident. ICs will assume control of the incident scene beyond the first responder awareness level, must receive at least 24 hours of training equal to the first responder operations level, and have competencies in the following areas. Know how to implement the employer's ICS. Know how to implement the employer's emergency response plan. Know and understand the hazards and risks associated with chemical protective clothing. They should also know how to implement the local emergency response plan, know of the state emergency response plan and the federal regional response team, know and understand the importance of decontamination procedures. OSHA regulations require annual refresher training and sufficient content on duration to ensure that responders maintain their competencies or that they demonstrate competency in those areas at least yearly. Other governmental agencies that you could encounter could be, in addition to OSHA and EPA, several governmental agencies are concerned with various aspects of hazardous materials response. The DOT promotes and publishes laws and regulations that govern the transportation of goods by highway, rail, pipeline, air, and in some cases marine transport. The EPA regulates and governs issues related to hazardous materials in the environment. With the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986, created the method and standard practice for a local community to understand and be aware of the chemicals hazards within their community. Under SARA Title III, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act requires that businesses that handle certain types and amounts of chemicals to report storage type, quantity, and storage methods to the fire departments and local emergency planning committees. Local emergency planning committees gather and disseminate information about hazardous materials to the public. They essentially ensure that local resources are adequate to respond to the chemical event in the community. And each state has a state emergency response commission that acts as the liaison between local and state level authorities. It is charged with the collection and dissemination of information related to hazardous materials emergencies. With pre-planning a response to an incident begins with your initial training, continuing education, and pre-planning activities that target hazards and other potential problems throughout your jurisdiction or response district. Target hazards include any occupancy type or facility that presents a high potential for loss of life or that presents serious impact to the community resulting from fire, explosion, or chemical release. Pre-planning activities enable agencies to develop logical and appropriate response procedures for anticipated incidents. Planning should focus on the real threats. Pre-planning at major target hazards should include discussions and information sharing with the LEPC. Once the threats have been identified, fire departments, police agencies, and public health offices and other governmental agencies should determine the most appropriate response and work together in case of a large-scale incident occurring. In many cases, the move toward interoperability before an incident will make the actual response work run smoothly. The incident change, and so must a material that can pose an unreasonable risk to human health, safety, or the environment when transported in commerce, used incorrectly, or not properly contained or stored. Governmental entities such as OSHA and the EPA issue and enforce regulations concerning hazardous materials emergencies. Consensus-based NFPA standards relating to hazardous materials are available for those agencies who choose to adopt them. 3 NFPA standards are important to responders who may be called upon to respond to hazardous materials incidents. Those include NFPA 472, Standard for Competence of Responders to Hazardous Materials Mass Destruction Incidents, NFPA 1072, Standard for Hazardous Materials Mass Destruction Emergency Response Personnel Professional Qualifications, NFPA 473, Standard for Competencies for EMS Personnel Responding to Hazardous Materials of Mass Destruction Incidents. And the OSHA HAZWAPI regulation is found in CFR Title 29, Standard 1910.120. The EPA's version of OSHA's HAZWAPI can be found in CFR Title 40, Protection of Environmental, Part 311, Worker Protection Act. The goals associated with the competencies of awareness level personnel are to recognize a potential hazardous materials emergency, to isolate the area, and to call for assistance. Awareness personnel take protective actions only. NFPA 472 expands the scope of an operations level responder's duties by making a distinctive between core competencies and mission specific competencies. For those who choose to adopt the NFPA 472 standard, the core competencies are required for all operations level responders. Each agency then can choose to pick and require any of the mission specific responsibilities. The core competencies of operations levels are considered defensive actions. And hazardous materials technicians will control a hazardous materials release using specialized protective clothing and control equipment. These hazardous materials incident commander is also responsible for all incident activities. And that concludes the end of Chapter 1.